very much people to what we could think of as, essentially the virtual and the informational realms. Then we did actually have candidates actually holding, rallies and the like. But what about a little terrorist attack? What about a little cyber operation or whatever? The information operations are often at their most effective when they are building off and amplifying real world effects. So that's just something that I was wondering if it was going to happen. And again, please understand, none of this is meant to be a kind of critique for of the players themselves. They were thrown in. They had whole election campaigns to work out in 1 hour. So it's just the kind of the things that I had been wondering about beforehand. And to kind of close, I was very struck by this bipartisan statement by the two candidates, which I'll be honest, I haven't been expecting. It's nice to see that players can sometimes be more mature than I'd imagine. Doesn't always happen, it has to be said. This, I think, was really quite powerful in terms of moving the overall dynamic of what's happening. Remember, this is not just about the candidates. This is actually about what happens to Ukraine, moving that towards a more resilient democratic sort of order. Can we expect that to happen in reality? I really don't know. I think there's still so many potential dysfunctions and pitfalls in the reality. The very fact that these sort of smears and such like could easily have taken off more if we had wanted to, in some ways, take the focus away just from the internal discussions of the players. We could have thrown in black or at least sort of muddy grey swan events into the course for people to react to. And in the real world, often that does happen. But, exactly, we didn't want to just basically make people responding. We wanted to actually make people defining the campaigns. But nonetheless, in that context, it will be interesting to see whether or not Ukraine can manage a similar bipartisanship to that which was demonstrated by the players. Now that, I'm sure there are all kinds of things that I will, in hindsight, when I'm on the train heading home, suddenly wish that I had said. But given that this is just my sort of snap response, those are the first thoughts that came to mind. Key takeaway, as I say, is that this could so easily have turned in a different direction. As it was, it went quite smoothly. It went quite democratically. We saw some movement in the polls and so forth, but no grand surprises and such like. This is not actually how things often turn out, and therefore it's a useful reminder of how things can be, but we shouldn't regard it as too much of a guide to what will happen. Thanks anyway, but thanks for everyone for their participation so actively.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this analysis. It was very insightful. And now, so if anyone has any question, please, for Mark or for us, could you please text them in the chat? And in the meanwhile, I was wondering if Robert wanted to explain a little bit about the Conducttr measurement of effects.
Yeah, just while we're waiting for some questions in. So with all of the people that were role-playing the influencers were given basically like an AI persona that was modeling that particular person. So they're given beliefs and goals, and they get given a memory so they can remember. And what was interesting in building that was how sort of pragmatic the responses were. So because, say, like if you take the main politicians and the vicar, the father, someone, and so on, when you ask them for support, or if you ask them to endorse a candidate, they responded in a very sort of nuanced, balanced way. They didn't rush to do anything, which I thought was quite good. And then the other thing we had going on And so that was feeding into, you know, your reactions. And also we had, I'll show this screen, share this one. So if you can see it, so basically we developed this app, and it's got the different axes of uncertainty. I don't know if I can make this a bit bigger. And what we were doing was when we detected something of importance, we would paste it in here and ask it to analyze the impact. And this little trail shows how basically we just kept progressing towards like a better democratic process. And what Mark and I were doing is, so when the AI completes its assessment, it gives a report of why it came to that conclusion. So there's a number of different like, I'm trying to think, like, not standards but specifications, some from ISO and some from our own Ministry of Defence, that wants to know about any bias in the AI. It wants to know, is this repeatable, and so on and so forth. And so in the stuff that we've been developing, it's quite important that we reveal the thinking process behind the decision. And so what's happened here is we gave it this input about Doven, you know, doing such and such, and then what it would do is it would calculate these scores, and if Mark and I disagreed, we could change it. So there was always a human in the loop, but it was pretty interesting. So for example, when Levchenko gave the rally in Dnipro, the AI saw this as very positive for democracy, because people were getting involved, and it wasn't, you know, the message was the right message. And then Mark and I looked at this and went, yeah, you know what, like, yeah, because it's, although the candidates are competing with each other, what we're modeling is democratic and information stability, and that actually worked. And so with all the things that we kept feeding it, the things that were notable, it actually kept going in that direction. And as we were saying, like the normal mischievous stuff from Russia was already priced in, so it didn't really move the needle in any particular direction. So I thought that was something that we considered as well.
Thank you very much, Rob, for this explanation. So we got a couple of questions, Mark, if you don't mind. So someone is asking, what do you think is going to be the most dangerous aspect of the next Ukrainian election when it comes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard one to answer for the simple reason that we don't know how and when it will happen. I mean, I think that the issue is really how far we find Ukrainian politicians doing what, frankly, one has to do in democratic elections, which is identifying and amplifying fault line issues. I mean, you know, basically, in very crude terms, you know, you win elections by creating fault line issues which you can use to cohere constituencies together, which tends to involve, while you're talking notionally about unity, in practice, othering, finding someone who is the outsider. Now, okay, that can be a foreigner, those damn Russians, but I'm not quite sure that will be enough, because I don't think there isn't going to be a candidate who says, actually, the Russians are nice people after all, and we could have done with a good bombing. So really, it is a question of actually how far politicians in reality succumb to the temptation of divisiveness. Because what we do know is that the Russians, in their various political war capabilities, they have no magic mind control powers. They can't take someone who is a loyal Ukrainian patriot and turn them into a traitor. But what they can do is radicalize. They can take people who have certain dissatisfactions, a sense that they have been marginalized, ignored, or whatever, and then turn that into a much, much more powerfully negative force. And particularly if you are the losing candidate, and maybe I mean, in hindsight, look, I mean, there's always ways that, this, if this war game had been running over, 2 days instead of 1 hour and had more players and had more staff and everything else, if there had been a candidate who was clearly losing, that's the candidate who's actually more tempted to play the divisive cards. As it was, Yevchenko was close enough to Dovhan that she had an incentive to essentially be a, national reconciliation candidate. If she was running on 10% of the vote, though, you might think, well, I've got nothing to lose. So let's start smearing Dovhan as a, corrupt crypto fascist in the pockets of the European Union or something like that, Polish farming, whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be the real issue in a real election. Remember, you will have multiple candidates almost certainly, which then refine down to 2 for the runoffs. And if someone doesn't win outright in the first round, in that first period, that's when there is a chance for damage to be done. Sorry, you have to excuse me, by the way, as I sort of sip away. I have a stinking cold, so I'm trying not to sort of sneeze and gurgle my way.
Regarding other questions, so we have, do you think in reality the influence of the action of the European Union and US could have a more outsized impact on the Ukrainian election compared to Russia?
The United States, probably not. Unless the United States was willing to do something and planning to do something particularly dramatic, like essentially, if you vote for that candidate, we will terminate all our assistance for you, or something like that, which could easily backfire. I mean, I'm minded to remember when Barack Obama told Britain that if they went through with Brexit, they'd be at the back of the queue. So I think the United States is unlikely. The European Union, much more so, not least because, look, it is clear that there is a hope and an even expectation that there will be rapid EU membership after the war. And in that context, if the European Union starts to backpedal on that and say, well, obviously that depends on your going through, leaping through these 14 bureaucratic hoops and such like, then that, for example, in this game, could well have undermined Dovhan's position. If it had been made much clearer that, for example, there needs to be root and branch reform of Ukrainian agriculture, as there will be, considering the importance of the common agricultural policy, then that would have buttressed Yevchenko's position with the rural voters, that kind of thing. So I think Europe, yes, not insofar as, I think, direct intervention, but just in terms of setting a kind of political context that will shape the debate inside Ukraine. And in theory, possibly even leading to a potential kind of stab in the back myth emerging. We were good enough to fight their war against the Russians, but we're not good enough to actually join their club. If the European Union looks sort of, shall I say, unimpressed by the idea of early Ukrainian membership.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Very insightful. And well, related to this last topic, I think there's like a second question, and which is, so what assumptions do you think are shaping our perceptions of the post-war in Ukraine? I wouldn't repeat the first part because it's more or less the same as the previous one.
I mean, our assumptions. I mean, in some ways, our assumptions don't matter all that much. It's more about Ukrainians' assumptions, as I said. I mean, I think our assumptions are that Ukraine will come out of this war committed to reconstruction, but essentially happy, and that they will regard us as their friends. And that may well be the case. There has been, after all, been sustained assistance, and I'm absolutely certain that there will be a lot of reconstruction assistance afterwards. However, there may not be. There is a fear, and I've heard this from Ukrainians, that once you're no longer getting harrowing pictures of corpses being pulled out of the collapsed, bombed shell of a hospital, then actually the urgency and the attention being paid to Ukraine may well decline quite quickly. And the desire to pour money into the reconstruction of Ukraine, especially given that a lot of that reconstruction will probably not be rebuilding houses and hospitals, but actually building arms factories. In that context, there is the risk that Europe thinks, well, Ukraine's been sorted now, and now it's up to the Ukrainians to deal with it, while the Ukrainians think otherwise. The only other sort of particular point I would make is there is a genuine and I think understandable belief that this war, this ghastly war, has been the crucible from which a genuine Ukrainian nation has emerged. I think that's perfectly true. We've had a series of abortive nation-building attempts, but this, I hesitate to say that Putin is the true father of the Ukrainian nation, but there is an element in which, in a horrific way, it's true. The old divisions between East and West, Orthodox, Catholic, urban, rural, don't matter as much. That doesn't mean to say that they don't matter at all. And again, I think there is a degree of myth-making about Ukraine. I've heard people say with an absolutely straight face that there is now no more corruption in Ukraine, for example. It's not quite so simple. So it's also a question how far we see Ukraine as it really is and how far we see Ukraine as we would like it to be, and then get outraged or disappointed when it turns out to be a country which does still have problems and is not some kind of paradise on earth. Okay. So I think these are the kind of issues we have to be aware of. And as I said, it's really more about just simply being realistic at a time when so many of our politicians, frankly, are relying on cliches and empty mantras. I see.
That's very interesting. So I think we have time for just one more question. So do you see a special relationship developing after the war with Poland and the Baltic states separately from the rest of the European Union?
I mean, I think it's possible. The thing is, we saw the irony, and but can I also answer the question about Bandura playing afterwards as it went afterwards? But there is this irony that Poland, for example, has been, really from the very beginning, a very forceful supporter of Ukraine's, and clearly very genuinely committed, and not just because of its own security interests, but also because of its own, I think it's fair to say, rather fraught relationship with Russia. And yet we still saw the spectacle of Polish farmers blocking Ukrainian trucks coming in with agricultural goods. And we've also seen Poland saying that, no, it will not contribute forces to this coalition of the willing or coalition of the moderately grudging, in many ways it's become by now, because they have to consider their own security interests. So I think, look, by definition, Ukraine will have to develop some kind of a particular and more focused relationship with Poland, as it will also have to with Romania. Maybe Hungary, but I'm not sure if Hungary will be in the market for that. But it will be a complex one. I mean, actually, relationships are a lot easier when you don't have borders with another country and when you don't have potentially competing agriculture and other interests. So I think that, there is the scope for a real, essentially, power block in Eastern Europe. I mean, Poland already is in some ways, and part of the reason why it has this extraordinary armament program at the moment, very high levels of spending, 1,000 modern tanks acquired or ordered, is because it's trying to make a point that, in fact, the real security guarantor of Central Europe is not Germany, but Poland, and that Poland is the kind of the rising power. In that context, a maybe Baltic, but primarily, a Polish-Ukrainian alliance would really shift the center of gravity of Europe in the longer term. So that's definitely a possibility. Okay. Anyway, just very briefly about this question about why Bandura playing is a red flag. And it's a fascinating example of two things, really. One is just simply sort of the random coincidence of things that sound the same. And the other one is history. The Bandura is this traditional Ukrainian sort of lute type instrument. which is very much became associated with Ukrainian nationalism, whether it really was or just simply in the minds of paranoid Soviet secret policemen. And so there was a massive campaign of repression against bandura players, including cases of massacres and such like, of people who just simply had the temerity to play a traditional Ukrainian musical instrument. And so, particularly to the Russians, there is still this kind of carryover, however ridiculous the idea has been, that it is in some ways a sort of a covert example of Ukrainian ultranationalism. But also bandura sounds like Bandera. Stefan Bandera, there's Ukrainian nationalist who the Russians regard as having been essentially been in bed with the Nazis. And so we've got this strange conflation that is built on, I won't say nothing, because bandura playing has become a sort of a part of Ukrainian national and cultural identity, but primarily on the basis of nothing. You find Russians thinking that bandura playing somehow is an expression of support for Stepan Bandera and what he stood for. Lunatic, but nonetheless, it gives some insight into some of the sort of the more bizarre complexities of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship.
Of course. So as we have many interesting questions, would you mind if we ask a couple more?
Sure.
So I see Joseph asked if you see ways to flip the situation where, well, he said, as mentioned, we do not have the same tools as at hand as we are restrained by democratic norms. He's talking about Russians. And do you see ways to flip this situation in a way that we can regain narrative superiority, or are we condemned to countering this narrative, this discourse, instead of leading it?
I mean, there is an extent to which we have to recognize that we are stuck in terms of responding. We can't play and shouldn't play the same games as the Russians, or indeed other antagonists. It's not just the Russians. It could just as easily be in the future the Chinese or the Iranians or whoever happens to emerge as the new antagonist of choice. So I think we have to realize the degree to which that, in a way, for a start, forces us onto the defense. However, it doesn't have to be quite as negative and reactive as it is now.
Okay.
And I think this is highlighting one of, the problems we've got is that, yes, now there's now so much talk about the perils of disinformation, the need for media literacy, hybrid warfare, defense, and all that kind of thing. There's a lot more headline than reality to that, though. And I think we have to recognize that the moment, regardless of what the Russians are doing or whatever, this is a moment in which actually sort of Western liberal democracy is in a bit of crisis for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that really it's based on assumptions about society rooted in the 19th century and certain sort of class loyalties and deference. So anyway, we would be in a difficult, chaotic moment in our society's evolution in which we're kind of feeling our way towards what is a 21st century form of democracy. Well, we need to be thinking about that more carefully rather than just thinking that our job is just simply to protect existing systems. We have to think about how we reform to preserve, we evolve to survive. And also...
But so do you think, do you think that Russia is actually in a better position compared to us, given this context?
Look, Russia is an authoritarian state in which, many Russians should be considered sort of the hostages rather than the accomplices of the Kremlin. Inevitably authoritarianisms, because they can censor, they can control, they can block, are in a better position in that one respect. There are all other kind of reasons, what ways in which they're in much worse positions. But also, the one thing that one can say is that successfully or not, the Putin regime is actually trying to articulate a particular vision for Russia, which not everyone will accept and often does not really conform to reality. But nonetheless, it is a powerful and compelling one that is being increasingly presented across the board, the same way as China has been very effective in building this kind of vision of China as sort of at once the hyper-capitalist socialism and so forth, but nonetheless a rising power. I do think, have slightly lost our way. We have got mired in the whole issues of historical guilts and such like. It's very hard for Western democracies to actually beat their chest convincingly and say, this is why we're great, without a few apologies along the way. So in that respect, again, I think authoritarianisms often do have the advantage. But frankly, final point I'd make is they also have the advantage of being the kind of the outsiders, the, as they say, losers. We do have a global order, which essentially was created by the West for the West's advantage. Nothing wrong with that, but nonetheless, we have to acknowledge that. And therefore, other countries actually also can define themselves in opposition to what we are. It's harder for us to define ourselves in opposition to them.
Okay, this is a very thought-provoking answer. And I would say maybe the last question. So is there like a scenario, a possible scenario that Ukraine people are feeling kind of forgotten, if not helped to rebuild, leaving a vulnerability for external actors to exploit?
Yes, I mean, I mentioned that I am concerned about the possibility for a sort of stab in the back myth to emerge. I mean, I remember I was speaking a while back to someone who in Kyiv, who absolutely would not be considered in any way a friend of Russia, but who was feeling very let down by the West, and said, look, we knew excuse my language, we knew the Russians were bastards. We thought the Europeans were our friends. And so, I mean, there is that scope, this notion that the West only provided the weapons necessary to keep the war going in order to bleed Russia rather than to win. I mean, I don't buy it myself, but nonetheless, it is a powerful one, especially because there are voices in the West who echo it. I don't know if we will sustain the kind of focus needed to rebuild Ukraine the way we promise we do.
Okay.
But we promise all kinds of things. And there's been a lot of focus of late about the real problem that Russia will face when the veterans come home. But I think we also need to recognize there's going to be a real problem when the veterans come home on the other side too. A lot of them are going to feel discarded, are going to feel let down, and they may well be a sort of a floating pool of individuals who could be captured by some kind of extreme movement, which could be anything. It could be ultra-nationalist, it could be leftist, it could be rightist, who knows? But the point is, I think, we have to recognize that Ukraine is going to likely to go through, particularly once the initial euphoria of the end of the war and the beginning of reconstruction and peace is over. It's going to go through some tough times. And is the West really going to be there with the right mix of, let's say, tough love and money? Because yes, there's going to have to be a lot of assistance and support, but that just doesn't mean they're simply saying, here, have a blank check. Because there are going to be concerns about waste, about corruption, about, as I mentioned, China just simply stepping in and saying, nice country, we'll buy it, in the way that they have since so many other sort of countries in the world. In that context, the West needs to find that way of balancing its own interests so it doesn't lose its willingness to support Ukraine and Ukraine's needs.
Do you think the Gulf countries could step into as well, like into this kind of help under, of course, an economic point of view?
This is the point. They're not going to do it just for the sake of goodness. They're going to do it because there's something there. And, now we have the example of the resources deal that was struck with the United States.
Yeah.
Now, on one level, this is just an empty fantasy deal because it's sort of all about revenue from investments which don't currently exist, which will anyway only happen after the war has ended, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, it establishes this principle that essentially Ukraine can be, in due course, after the first period, 10 years, it can be raided for funds to the United States. And personally, Europe's going to be saying, where's our benefit from our support? And so the question is, what would be then available? Now, the Chinese, as I said, might well step in and say, we'll build you your railways and whatever else, because they do those rather well these days. The Gulf states, sure, they could step in, but one has to ask the question, what will they expect as their payoff? Is their payoff a kind of lateral one? Because let's say a country like Saudi Arabia sometimes puts money into projects as essentially wereguild. We've done bad things, but if we put money here or buy your planes or whatever else,
sort of greenwashing.
Exactly, you'll pretend it's not the case. Well, you know, it might be that, for example, the Gulf states might say, you know, we continue to launder money on an industrial scale, including at the moment Russian money. But as long as we're investing in Ukraine, everyone can ignore that. That might be good for Ukraine, probably not good for the world. So, you know, these are difficult trade-offs, I think, will be.
Thank you very much, Mark. So I would say that as a wrap up, do you already know when your next book is coming out?
The next book, funny you should ask that. Absolutely. In August, my next book comes out, and actually it's not about Russia for once. It's called Homo Criminalis, and it's basically a history of the world told through the medium of organized crime.
Oh, wow.
So everything you ever wanted to know about Renaissance fraud or Aztec cocoa bean counterfeiting, or in the modern era, you know, what 3D printing and so forth is doing, but very much with the theme of actually how far has the upper world not just shaped the underworld, but also been shaped by it. So a must buy for August. That's
great. So if there's not any other question, or if you haven't, I mean, maybe you spot
I think people have listened to me enough.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you very much, everyone, for being so active in the Wargame. And it was a pleasure. I hope everyone had fun. And yeah, thank you. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.